$40 an acre. That was the number a bank examiner wrote on a single line of a government form on a Thursday afternoon in September 2018 in an office that smelled of cheap coffee and recycled air. $40 an acre, multiplied by 340, applied against a loan balance. And 40 years of Ray Briggs's life was reduced to an arithmetic problem that someone else had already solved. Nora Briggs stood on the porch of the homestead when the truck pulled away. She was 58 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and she had been standing on that porch since before sunrise because she had known, in the way a person knows a storm is coming before the clouds arrive, that this was the day. She watched the dust settle behind the truck. She did not move until it was completely gone. Then she went inside, opened the field journal she had kept since 1987, turned to a blank page near the back, and wrote 3 words at the top. Not finished yet. She did not cry until much later, and even then, only once. Alone in the barn at 2 in the morning, with her hand pressed flat against the wall where Ray used to hang his work coat. After that, she did not cry again. Ray Briggs had been a wheat farmer the way some men are preachers. Not because it made him rich, not because it was easy, because he could not imagine being anything else. He had inherited 400 acres from his father in 1981, married Nora Calloway in 1983, and spent the next 35 years shaping that ground into something that produced. He was not a perfect man. He was proud in the way that made him hide problems rather than ask for help, and that pride had cost them everything. The operating debts had started accumulating around 2012 when back-to-back drought years hit Garfield County hard enough to leave half the farms in the county gasping. Ray had taken loans to cover the gaps, then loans to cover the loans. He had not told Nora because he was going to fix it. He kept telling himself that. Right up until the heart attack took him in July 2016 and left her standing in a hospital corridor being told by a banker she had never met that there were documents she needed to sign. She had signed. She had kept the 40-acre homestead parcel and the truck and the border collie named Pepper. She had let everything else go without a single public word of complaint, because complaining was not something Nora Briggs had ever considered a useful activity. By the winter of 2018, she was running a small operation on the 40 acres, enough to keep herself busy, not enough to call a livelihood. She drove to the feed store. She went to church on Sundays. She read the agricultural extension bulletins that came in the mail and argued with them mentally on her morning walks, because most of them were written by people who had studied land without ever developing a relationship with it. She was not looking for an opportunity. She was not the kind of person who used that word, what she was doing. On a cold morning in late February 2019, was walking the fence line of her remaining 40 acres before sunrise, as she had done every morning for 3 decades. And she happened to take a longer route than usual, and that longer route took her past the eastern boundary of the land the Decker brothers had been trying to unload for the better part of 2 years. The Decker brothers, Cole and Warren, had inherited 1,600 acres from their father Earl in 1994. Earl Decker had been a difficult man who understood land as a physical thing, something you worked with your hands and kept a physical relationship with. His sons understood land as a financial instrument. They were not cruel men. They were simply men who had learned to see the world through a single lens, and that lens was yield per acre, assessed value, and drainage grade. They had made good decisions with most of what they inherited, selling off underperforming parcels systematically, reinvesting, expanding in better locations to the west. The 220 acres on the eastern edge of their holdings had been a problem they had stopped trying to solve. It had not produced a viable crop in 11 years. The soil tested high in sodium carbonate, what farmers called white alkali, a pale, crusty surface that formed when mineral-rich water rose slowly through the ground, evaporated near the surface, and left its chemical deposits behind like the water line on a bathtub. The previous tenant had abandoned it after 3 seasons. The irrigation infrastructure had collapsed. The single pond had reduced to a cracked, muddy bowl ringed with salt deposits. Even the native grasses had given up on most of it. Cole Decker had described it to Warren the previous fall as a liability wearing the costume of an asset, and Warren had laughed and said they should just give it away to whoever would take the title fees. They priced it at $5,200, not out of generosity, out of a desire to stop paying property tax on something that produced nothing. The auction was held at the Garfield County Equipment and Property Exchange on a Tuesday morning in March 2019. It was the kind of event that drew a specific crowd, farmers looking for bargains, small investors hoping to flip rural parcels, and a handful of representatives from larger companies who attended these things the way a fisherman checks a trap line, not expecting much, just maintaining the habit. Vantage Energy Resources had sent a representative named Grant Hollis. He was 34 years old, held an MBA from the University of Texas, wore a jacket that cost more than the monthly operating expenses of most farms in the county, and had the particular manner of a man who had been told he was talented so many times that he had stopped questioning it. His official title was VP of Land Acquisitions, and his unofficial role at events like this was to make sure competitors did not pick up parcels in areas where Vantage had strategic interests. He was not there to buy the Decker land. He was there to make sure no one interesting bought it. When the auctioneer opened bidding on Lot 7, the 220 acres on the eastern edge of the Decker holdings, there was a pause of the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously decides not to raise their hand. Then Nora Briggs, sitting in the fourth row in her good jacket and her work boots, raised her hand. The bid was $5,200. No one countered. Hollis did not raise his hand because he had been told by his supervisor the previous week that the Eastern Decker parcel was not on their active acquisition list. He watched Nora walk to the registration table. He said something to the man beside him. The man laughed. Hollis straightened his jacket and moved on to the next lot. Cole Decker shook Nora's hand in the parking lot afterward with the expression of someone who has successfully unloaded a problem. He said the irrigation pump had not worked in 4 years and that the east fence needed replacing about 1.5 miles. He said she was welcome to the old equipment shed on the north end, though he could not promise what was in it. Warren Decker stood beside his brother and said nothing for a moment. Then he said the old GeoStar survey from a few years back found nothing useful, but the file is probably still in the shed if she wanted it for reference. Nora thanked them both. She drove home. She fed Pepper. She made coffee. She opened her field journal and wrote GeoStar survey, shed, north end. The neighbors heard about the purchase the way news travels in small counties, through the feed store, through Sunday parking lots, through the particular telephone of a rural community that has not yet found a more efficient system. The reaction was consistent. Curtis Flynn was the first person to say it to her face. He was 67 years old, had farmed the land adjacent to the Decker parcel for 40 years, and considered himself a fair judge of agricultural prospects. He came by on Wednesday morning while she was loading fence posts into her truck. He said, "Nora, I have watched that ground for 20 years. It will not grow a cactus." She said, "Morning, Curtis." He said, "I am not trying to be unkind. I am telling you what I know." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "That is white alkali over most of it. You know what white alkali means for root systems?" She said, "I do." He stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets, waiting for her to say something that would make the conversation feel more like an exchange and less like a bulletin. She loaded another fence post. He drove away. The county extension office was more formal. Nora applied for a small improvement loan to begin assessing the property, the kind of loan designed to help landowners invest in basic infrastructure evaluation. The loan officer, a man in his early 40s named Dennis Pryor, who wore his expertise like a protective vest, reviewed the application for 6 minutes and then told her that the assessed value of the parcel did not support the loan amount because there was no reasonable agricultural basis for improvement. He used the phrase reasonable agricultural basis twice, which suggested to Nora that he had recently learned it. She thanked him and drove back to the property. There was a piece in the county agricultural newsletter 3 weeks later. It did not mention Nora by name. It referenced, in a small paragraph near the back, a recent sale of unproductive alkali land in the eastern part of the county, and included a quote from Hollis of Vantage Energy Resources, who had apparently been contacted for comment. He said decisions made on the basis of sentiment rather than data analysis are a recurring pattern in rural property markets and rarely end well for the buyer. Nora read the paragraph. She set the newsletter on the kitchen table. She went back outside. What she was doing every morning before sunrise was something she had been doing since the first week she took ownership of the property. She walked it, not the whole 220 acres every day. That would take more time than she had, but a rotating grid she had marked in her journal. Methodical, overlapping, the same approach she had used to understand every piece of ground she had ever worked. She measured things. She carried the hand probe she had kept behind the truck seat for 20 years. A simple tool, a long steel rod with a moisture indicator that cost $32 in 1999 and had paid for itself in information more times than she could count. She wrote everything down. The surface of the Decker land behaved exactly as advertised for approximately 190 of its 220 acres. The white alkali crust was consistent. The soil beneath it was compacted and sodium heavy. The probe came up dry at 18 inches across most of the parcel, confirming what the surface chemistry suggested: a ground that repelled moisture rather than absorbing it, a hard pan that sat just below the root zone like a sealed floor. But the northeastern corner was different. It was not dramatically different. Nothing about it announced itself. The alkali crust thinned in that corner, not disappearing but becoming less uniform, as if whatever process had deposited it had been slightly interrupted. The land there dipped very gently toward the line of an old unnamed creek that had been dry for decades, its channel still visible as a faint depression in the terrain, a ghost of water that the map still showed with a dotted line. Along that channel, growing in a thin, interrupted line that followed the depression exactly, was a seam of volunteer grass. Not much, not the kind of thing that would catch a passing eye, but the grass was green in the specific way that requires consistent moisture. Not the faded olive of drought-adapted natives, but the green of something that was drinking regularly from somewhere below. On the 9th morning, Nora pressed her hand probe into the soil in the northeastern corner, 18 inches down, the same depth that came up dry everywhere else on the parcel. The probe came up moist. She pulled it out. She pushed it in again 6 feet to the left. Moist. She stood up slowly and looked at the line of grass following the old creek channel. She looked at the pale, crusty surface of the surrounding ground, that white alkali film that everyone had diagnosed as evidence of the land's death. She had studied soil chemistry for a long time. She knew that white alkali formed when mineral-rich water rose slowly through subsoil layers, evaporated near the surface, and left its chemical load behind. It was a process that required water rising from below, not rainwater descending from above, water moving upward, persistently, over time. The surface had been telling everyone the land was dead. What it had actually been telling anyone who read it correctly was that something beneath it had been alive for a very long time. Nora did not tell anyone what she had found. She went home. She fed Pepper. She made coffee. She opened her journal and wrote 4 lines of measurements. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a while and looked at the window without really looking at it, the way a person looks when they are thinking about something that is too large to think about all at once. For 23 consecutive mornings after that, she walked the northeastern corner of the property before the sun came up and measured everything she could measure with the tools she had. She expanded her grid, mapping the moisture zone, identifying its edges, tracking where it softened and where it disappeared. The moisture was not uniform. It was strongest along the old creek channel and diminished moving in any direction away from it. It was present every single morning, regardless of whether it had rained. The alkali surface directly above the moisture zone was slightly different in color than the surrounding ground. Lighter, more uniform. The kind of uniformity that results from a consistent process happening consistently over a long time. She pulled the GeoStar survey file from the equipment shed on a Saturday afternoon. It was in a manila folder inside a battered metal box with the Decker name written on the side in black marker. The file was 12 pages. Most of it was technical notation she would need help interpreting. But on page 7 there was a site map, and on the site map the old creek channel was marked, and beside it in the margin, in small handwritten pencil, someone had written the letters PRA and put a question mark after them. She photographed that page with her phone. Then she sat on an overturned bucket in the shed for a while and looked at the photograph. PRA. Potential recharge area. Whoever had done this survey had noticed something. They had noticed it and written it in pencil in the margin and then, apparently, not included it in whatever formal findings they had submitted. Nora closed the file and put it back in the box. She drove home. That evening, she looked up GeoStar, Geological Services, in the county business registry. The company was no longer independently listed. She searched further. GeoStar had been acquired and merged into a larger entity in 2016. The acquiring company was Vantage Energy Resources. She set her phone face down on the table. She sat very still for several minutes. Then she picked up the phone and found the number for Dr. Samuel Holden at Oklahoma State University. She had met him at an agricultural water management conference in 2014. He had given a presentation on aquifer recharge zones in the southern plains that she had thought about several times in the years since without quite knowing why. She had kept his card in the back of her journal. It was 9:30 in the evening. She did not call. She wrote the number in her current journal entry and underlined it once. She would call in the morning. She looked at what she had written over the past 23 days, column after column of moisture readings, depth measurements, location coordinates she had marked with stakes, notes on the grass line, notes on the alkali surface, notes on what the probe felt like going in compared to what it felt like in the dead zones to the west. It was the record of someone who had refused to decide that something was worthless before she had finished looking at it. Ray had always said she was stubborn past the point of reason. He had meant it as a complaint. She had never taken it that way. The 40 acres she had kept from the original farm were 12 miles to the west. She had driven past them more times than she could count in the past year, had slowed down each time but never stopped. The bank that held them had not yet found a buyer. The land was not producing. It was sitting. She was not ready to think about that yet. She had something in front of her that required her full attention. And she had learned long ago that divided attention was a luxury that small operations could not afford. She closed the journal. She let Pepper out for the last time that night. She stood on the porch in the dark and looked east toward the 220 acres she had bought for the price of a used truck, and she thought about a probe coming up moist 18 inches down in ground that everyone else had walked away from, and what it meant that she had been the one still standing there when it did. Most people who had looked at that land had seen a problem, a chemical imbalance, a failed crop history, a surface that repelled investment the same way it repelled rain. Nora Briggs had looked at the same surface and asked a different question. Not what is wrong with this land. What is this land trying to say? She went inside. She slept 4 hours. She was up before dawn and walking the field again. Journal in her left hand, probe in her right, writing down what the earth was telling her. In the same handwriting she had used since 1987, patient and specific and completely certain that the answer was there, that it had always been there, that it was simply a matter of being willing to stay long enough to find it. She called Dr. Holden at 7:15 the next morning. He picked up on the third ring, which surprised her. She had expected a department voicemail and had prepared a careful message. Instead, she got the man himself, slightly out of breath, as if he had just come in from somewhere. She told him who she was. There was a brief pause, and then he said he remembered her. the conference in 2014, she had asked the sharpest question of the afternoon session about capillary rise rates in sodium-heavy subsoils. He said he had thought about that question more than once since then. She told him what she had found. She read him 23 days of measurements over the phone, column by column, the way she would read a crop report. She did not editorialize. She did not tell him what she thought it meant. She simply read the numbers. When she finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for her to wonder if the call had dropped. Then he said, "Nora, I need you to let me come look at that." He was 58 years old, the same age as Nora, with the specific kind of weathered patience that develops in people who spend careers measuring things that move too slowly for anyone else to notice. He drove down from Stillwater on a Thursday in May with two graduate students and a set of equipment that filled the back of his SUV. He did not make predictions. He did not use encouraging language. He walked the northeastern corner of the 220 acres the same way Nora had walked it, methodically, with his eyes down and his attention full. He spent 6 weeks on the property. He brought additional equipment on his second visit, and on his third, he brought a colleague from the Oklahoma Water Resources Board who spent a single afternoon walking the site and said very little and left with a folder of preliminary readings. Nora fed them all coffee and did not ask questions until they were ready to answer them. The answer came on a Tuesday evening in late June, when Dr. Holden sat across from Nora at her kitchen table with a map spread between them and a set of readings organized into columns that looked not entirely unlike her own journal pages. What lay beneath the northeastern section of the 220 acres was an aquifer recharge zone. The geology beneath the property connected to a significantly larger underground formation that extended in a southwest arc across several miles of Garfield County subsoil. The aquifer itself was not under her land entirely, but the recharge zone, the area where surface and near-surface permeability allowed water to move downward and replenish the underground formation. That zone was centered almost exactly on the old creek channel that ran through her northeastern corner. The white alkali surface that had told every previous owner the land was dead had been produced by exactly the opposite process. Mineral-rich water had been rising slowly through the subsoil for decades, driven by pressure from the aquifer below, evaporating near the surface and leaving its chemical trace behind. The surface had not been a symptom of absence. It had been the signature of presence. The aquifer formation, based on Holden's assessment, confirmed by two independent geological survey firms over the following 3 months, had the capacity to sustain major agricultural and municipal water supply for the region for 40 years at responsible extraction rates. In a part of Oklahoma entering its 5th consecutive year of below-average rainfall, what sat beneath Nora's 220 acres was not simply water. Holden told her the independent valuation of the water rights, given current market conditions and projected regional demand, was somewhere between $35 and $42 million. Nora looked at the map for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Who else knows?" Holden said he had kept the findings within his small team pending her direction. His graduate students had signed standard research confidentiality agreements. The colleague from the Water Resources Board had seen only preliminary data. Nora nodded. She looked at the map again. She thought about the GeoStar file sitting in the metal box in the equipment shed. She thought about the penciled notation on page 7. She thought about Warren Decker saying the words GeoStar and nothing useful in the same breath in a parking lot 4 months ago. She said, "I need to show you something." She brought the file from the shed. She opened it to page 7 and set it in front of Holden without comment. He looked at the margin notation for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. He said, "Who did this survey?" She told him. She told him about GeoStar being acquired by Vantage Energy in 2016. She told him about Hollis sitting in the 4th row at the county auction in March, and about the quote in the agricultural newsletter. Holden sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man reorganizing what he thought he understood. He said they knew. She said someone at that company knew there was something here worth looking at. Whether they knew exactly what it was, I cannot say. but they knew enough to buy the company that had the data, and they knew enough to send someone to that auction. He said, and he did not bid. She said he did not bid. The room was quiet. Outside. Pepper moved across the porch and settled against the door. Holden said he wanted to bring in a water rights attorney before they took any further steps. He had someone in mind, a specialist in Oklahoma water law named Joanna Pierce, who worked out of Oklahoma City. He had collaborated with her on 2 previous cases involving competing claims to groundwater resources. She was direct, she was meticulous, and she worked on contingency in cases with clear financial stakes. She would not cost Nora anything unless they prevailed. Nora said call her. Word travels in small counties through mechanisms that have nothing to do with intention. Nora had told no one. Holden's team had maintained their agreements. And yet by the second week of July, something had shifted in the particular atmospheric pressure of local knowledge that surrounds any piece of ground when its value begins to change. She noticed it first at the feed store. A man she did not recognize was asking the owner questions about land parcels on the eastern edge of the county, phrased casually, the way questions are phrased when the person asking them does not want to appear to be asking. She noticed it because she had been in that store for 30 years, and she knew what casual sounded like in that room, and that was not it. 3 days later, a truck she did not recognize drove slowly past the property twice in one morning. She wrote down the plate number without changing her expression or her pace. On the 18th of July, Grant Hollis knocked on her door. He was dressed less formally than he had been at the auction. He had made an effort toward approachability, open collar, no jacket, a truck instead of the sedan she had seen him drive before. He smiled the way people smile when they have been coached to seem friendly by people who have never quite mastered the skill themselves. He said he was in the area and thought he would stop by to see how the property was coming along. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said, "Come in." She made coffee. She set it in front of him. She sat across the table and waited. He said Vantage Energy had been reviewing its regional land portfolio and had identified some potential synergies with properties in the Eastern County area. He said they were prepared to make a fair and competitive offer for the 220 acres, one that reflected current market conditions and provided her with a meaningful return on her initial investment. He slid an envelope across the table. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. She said, "What is in it?" He said, $850,000, cash sale, 30-day close, no contingencies. The number sat in the air between them. It was 163 times what she had paid for the land 4 months earlier. For a woman who had held on to 40 acres as the remnant of a life that had largely been taken from her, it was a number that had weight. She picked up the envelope. She looked at the check inside. She set it back down. She said this land was worthless 4 months ago. You said so yourself. In the paper. He said the company had done some additional assessment and revised their view. She said, "What did your additional assessment find?" He said, "It was proprietary information." She said, "I see." He said he hoped she would consider the offer seriously. He said it was a strong number for land in this condition and this location. He said the company was prepared to move quickly if she was ready to move. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked out the kitchen window at the line of the property in the distance. She thought about a pencil notation in a margin. She thought about a company that had bought the firm that wrote that notation. She thought about a man sitting in the 4th row of an auction, watching her raise her hand and then deciding not to raise his own. She said, "I will think about it." He left the envelope on the table. She moved it to the shelf beside the door without opening it again. After he was gone, she called Joanna Pierce. Pierce drove down from Oklahoma City on a Friday morning, a compact woman in her late 40s with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned that preparation was the only form of confidence that held under pressure. She read everything. She read Holden's full report, the GeoStar file including the margin notation, 23 days of morning measurements, and the offer letter from Vantage. She asked questions in the precise way of someone who already understands the shape of the answer and is confirming details. On the second day, Pierce found something in the Oklahoma Water Resources Board database that changed the shape of everything. A geological survey report filed under GeoStar letterhead in late 2016 submitted to the Oklahoma Water Resources Board as part of a routine regional assessment had recorded findings for the eastern Garfield County sector. The report concluded no significant subsurface water resources identified. The report had been reviewed and filed without further action. The engineer who had signed and submitted that report was now employed by Vantage Energy Resources as a senior geophysical consultant. Pierce pulled the original field data that accompanied the filing. Field data submitted alongside formal reports is typically technical and voluminous and rarely reviewed in detail. She reviewed it in detail. The field data contained anomalies consistent with a significant recharge zone. The anomalies had not been mentioned in the formal conclusions. They had not been noted or flagged or designated for follow-up. They had been present in the data and absent from the summary, which meant someone had made a specific decision about what to include and what to leave out. Pierce set the documents side by side on the kitchen table and explained what she was looking at. Nora listened without interrupting. When Pierce finished, she said, "Is that illegal?" Pierce said filing a materially false report with a state resource agency is fraud. Whether it rises to criminal fraud or remains civil depends on what we can demonstrate about intent, but either way, it is not nothing. Nora said, "What do we do with it?" Pierce has said, "First, we protect your rights. Then, we use what we have." The protection came in the form of a formal filing with the Oklahoma Water Resources Board, initiated by Pierce on Nora's behalf, registering a claim to groundwater rights under the prior appropriation doctrine applicable to her 220 acres. The filing was supported by Holden's full report and triggered a 60-day administrative review period during which competing claims would be evaluated. Vantage Energy filed a competing claim 11 days later. Their legal argument was that the aquifer formation extended beyond the boundaries of Nora's surface ownership and therefore could not be exclusively claimed by a single surface landowner. It was a standard argument in Oklahoma water law, not without precedent, the kind of argument that large energy companies with large legal departments used to complicate smaller claimants' positions long enough to wear them down financially. Pierce had expected it. She had a response prepared before the filing arrived. Then Curtis Flynn came to Nora's door on a Wednesday afternoon in August, with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long. He stood on the porch and said, "Nora, I need to tell you something." She opened the door wider and said, "Come in." He sat at the kitchen table and told her that a man from Vantage Energy had approached him twice in June, the second time with an envelope. The envelope had contained $40,000 in a cashier's check made out to him personally. They had asked him for the old irrigation and water survey maps of the Eastern County area that his father had commissioned in 1968, maps that showed the historical flow patterns of the unnamed creek and the water behavior of the land going back 60 years. The kind of information that did not exist in any digital database and could only come from someone who had been in this county long enough to know where the paper was. He said he had given them the maps. He put the cashier's check on the table. He said it had never been cashed. She looked at the check for a long time. She looked at Curtis. She said, "Why are you telling me this now?" He said, "Because they filed that claim against you last week. And I know what I gave them is in that filing. And I know what I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I owe $41,000 to the hospital in Enid for Miriam's treatment. She has been in and out since February. I am not telling you that as an excuse. I am telling you because I want you to understand I was not trying to hurt you. I was trying to keep my wife alive." Nora sat with that for a moment. She said, "Did you sign anything with them?" He said, "No." She said, "Did they give you anything in writing?" He said, "2 emails and a text message on my phone." She said, I need you to forward all of it to Joanna Pierce. Her number is on that pad by the phone. He nodded. He stood up. He left the check on the table. She picked it up after he was gone and set it beside the Vantage offer envelope on the shelf by the door. Two pieces of paper that represented two different kinds of pressure applied to two different kinds of person. She thought about Curtis for a while without judgment, because judgment required a certainty about what she would have done in his position that she was not prepared to claim. But the maps Curtis had provided were the same maps that showed the historical Creek behavior, and that Creek behavior was part of what Vantage was using to argue that the recharge zone was a shared regional resource rather than something specific to her parcel. Without those maps, their argument was considerably weaker. With the knowledge of how they had obtained them and the electronic record of the transaction, their argument was something else entirely. Pierce reviewed the emails and the text messages on a Thursday morning. Then she called Nora and said, I need you to look at something. She noted the dates. Vantage had filed their competing claim on a Thursday. Curtis had received the second approach from their representative on the Monday of the same week, 3 days before the filing was submitted. The information he had provided was already built into the claim before the ink was dry. That was not a coincidence. That was a pipeline. And it ran from someone with knowledge of Holden's investigation directly to Vantage's legal team before the public record showed any reason for them to know. Pierce, this changes our position significantly. They are not simply a legal adversary with a competing claim. They are a company with exposure they have not yet begun to calculate. The 60-day administrative review period was still running. The formal hearing before the Water Resources Board was scheduled for late September. Vantage's legal team was filing motions at a pace designed to slow the process and increase costs on Nora's side. What they did not know was that Holden had spent a portion of the previous week reviewing the county historical records and had found something in the Federal Land Administration files from 1958. It was a water rights priority designation issued by the Bureau of Land Reclamation under the Federal Prior Appropriation Framework, applicable to the entire watershed basin that included the old creek channel running through the northeastern corner of the 220 acres. The designation had been issued to the agricultural users of the basin collectively, registered under a federal instrument that predated the current state filing system and carried priority status over any subsequent claim within the same geological formation. The document was real. It had been filed, recorded, and indexed. It had simply not been relevant to anyone for 60 years because no one had known there was anything worth claiming in that particular piece of ground. Pierce read it 3 times. Then she called Nora and said, I need you to come to Oklahoma City. Nora drove up on a Friday morning. She sat in Pierce's office and listened to an explanation of what the 1958 designation meant under current Oklahoma water law and what it meant specifically in the context of the claim Vantage had filed. She listened to all of it. When Pierce finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, will it hold? Pierce said it will hold. Nora looked out the window at the Oklahoma City skyline, a view she did not particularly like or dislike. It was simply a view that was not her field and not her morning sky. And she thought about $40 an acre applied to a balance sheet by a man in a government office who had never once set foot on the land he was pricing. She thought about a pencil mark in a margin that one honest person had written and been forbidden to say out loud, and how long it had waited for someone to come looking. She said, then we are ready. Pierce nodded once and picked up her pen. The drive back from Oklahoma City took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nora made it in silence. No radio, just the sound of the highway and the particular quality of late August light falling flat across the plains in a way that made everything look simultaneously vast and close. She had made that drive dozens of times over the decades, usually for something administrative, a filing, a loan application, a meeting that could have been a phone call. This time, she drove back carrying something she had not driven up with. Not a document, not a plan, something closer to certainty, which was different from confidence and considerably more useful. She stopped once, outside of Chickasha. at a gas station where she had stopped probably 100 times before. She filled the tank. She bought a bottle of water. The woman behind the counter was someone she did not know. Nora paid and said thank you and walked back to the truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about what Pierce had said. It will hold 2 words. The specific economy of a person who does not say things they do not mean. She started the truck and drove the rest of the way home. The administrative hearing before the Oklahoma Water Resources Board was scheduled for the 23rd of September. Vantage Energy's legal team had filed 4 separate motions in the weeks leading up to it, each one designed to delay, complicate, or reframe the proceedings in a direction more favorable to their position. Pierce had responded to each one with the methodical precision of someone who had anticipated them before they arrived. She told Nora that the volume of filings was itself information, that companies with strong positions did not typically work this hard to slow things down. Nora understood what that meant. The hearing room and the Water Resources Board occupied the 3rd floor of a state building in Oklahoma City that smelled of institutional carpet and old paper. It was not a courtroom. It had no jury box, no gallery in the formal sense, though a dozen people were seated along the side wall when Nora arrived with Pierce on a Tuesday morning in late September. Holden was there. 2 of his graduate students were there with document boxes. The board consisted of 3 administrators seated behind a long table, professionals in state water management who had seen variations of this kind of dispute many times before and wore that familiarity in the measured pace of how they moved through their papers. Vantage had sent 4 attorneys. Hollis sat behind them in the 2nd row, dressed in the kind of suit that was designed to communicate seriousness without appearing to try. He did not look at Nora when she came in. He looked at his phone, then put it away, then looked at the table. Cole Decker was already seated near the back. He had driven up alone. He was 61 years old, wearing a shirt that had been ironed recently, and he had the expression of a man who had arrived at a place he had not intended to be and was trying to determine the least damaging route through it. The lead administrator called the session to order and outlined the procedural framework. This was an administrative hearing, not a trial. The standard was the preponderance of evidence. The outcome would be a formal determination of water rights priority applicable to the Garfield County formation identified in Dr. Holden's report, and that determination would carry the force of state administrative law. Vantage's lead attorney opened. He was a tall man named Bryce Calloway, who spoke with the particular fluency of someone who had spent 20 years making complicated things sound simple in rooms like this one. He acknowledged that Nora Briggs owned the surface rights to the 220 acres. He did not dispute that. He argued that the aquifer formation beneath that surface extended across a significantly larger geographic area, making it a regional resource rather than a parcel-specific one, and that under Oklahoma law, the extraction rights for regional aquifer formations were subject to shared administration rather than single owner control. He cited 3 cases. He cited state statute. He was organized, and he was smooth, and he spoke for 22 minutes without once mentioning Geostar. Pierce let him finish. She had a yellow pad in front of her with 6 lines written on it. She did not add to them while Calloway spoke. When it was her turn, she stood up and said she would be presenting 3 categories of evidence and that the board would find them straightforward. The first was Holden's report. He presented it himself, walking the board through the methodology and findings with the practiced clarity of a man who had explained complex hydrogeology to non-specialists many times and had learned that precision and simplicity were not opposites. He was on the stand for 40 minutes. Vantage's attorneys objected to 3 of his characterizations. The board overruled all 3. When Calloway cross-examined him, Holden answered every question with the patience of someone who had been asked harder questions by graduate students at 7 in the morning and had not found those particularly difficult either. The second category was the 1958 federal priority designation. Pierce set the document before the board. She walked through its provenance issued by the Bureau of Land Reclamation, recorded in the Federal Land Administration System, applicable to the watershed basin that included the recharge zone identified in Holden's report. She explained the prior appropriation framework and what priority status meant in practical terms. She cited the relevant federal statute. She cited two Oklahoma Supreme Court decisions that had addressed the interaction between federal prior appropriation designations and subsequent state water claims. Callaway objected on relevance grounds. He argued that a 66-year-old federal instrument with no active extraction history had effectively been abandoned and could not be resurrected to defeat a current commercial claim. Pierce responded that abandonment under prior appropriation law required documented non-use combined with intent to abandon, that neither condition was present here because the formation had not been known to exist in exploitable terms until Holden's report was filed in the current year, and that the federal designation remained active and on record and carried the priority it had always carried. The board asked two clarifying questions. Pierce answered both of them in under a minute. The lead administrator made a note and moved on. Then Pierce introduced the GeoStar file. She did not dramatize it. She set the original 12-page survey document before the board with the field data attached and explained what it was: a geological survey commissioned by the previous landowners in 2015, conducted by GeoStar Geological Services, which had been acquired by Vantage Energy Resources in 2016. She directed the board's attention to page 7, to the margin notation, PRA with a question mark, written in pencil by the field surveyor. She then set beside it the formal report that GeoStar had filed with the Oklahoma Water Resources Board in late 2016 under the same project reference number. She directed the board's attention to the conclusions section of the formal report, which stated that no significant subsurface water resources had been identified in the eastern Garfield County sector. She said the field data and the formal conclusions are inconsistent. The anomalies present in the field data that correspond to a recharge zone are not mentioned, not qualified, and not flagged in the formal report. The engineer who signed and submitted the formal report is currently employed by Vantage Energy Resources as a senior geophysical consultant. The room was quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of people waiting for the next thing to happen, the quiet of people who had just understood what had already happened. Callaway was on his feet. He said the chain of custody for the GeoStar documents had not been established, that the margin notation was informal and unattributable, that the formal report had been filed by a licensed engineer in good standing with the state, and that connecting a current Vantage employee to a document filed before they joined the company was speculative and prejudicial. Pierce said the chain of custody was established by the original file materials retrieved from the property, which had been transferred to Nora Briggs as part of the land sale and were therefore her legal property. She said the margin notation was written in the same hand as the field notes signed by the surveyor, whose name appeared on both documents. She said she was not arguing that the Vantage employee had written the false report while employed by Vantage. She was arguing that Vantage had acquired GeoStar in 2016, had thereby acquired access to all GeoStar field data, including the genuine findings for this formation, and had proceeded to send a representative to the auction where the land was sold without bidding and without disclosing to the buyer what the acquired data suggested about the property's subsurface value. She set the auction registration records before the board showing Hollis's attendance. She said the company knew there was something here. The question this board does not need to resolve today is whether that knowledge constitutes fraud. That question is under separate consideration. What this board does need to resolve today is whether the water rights claim filed by Vantage Energy, relying in part on historical survey data obtained through a private payment to a third party, and filed by a company with prior undisclosed knowledge of this formation's existence, should be given priority over the claim of the surface landowner, supported by independent scientific assessment and a federal priority designation that predates all other claims on record. She sat down. Cole Decker was called as a witness. He walked to the front of the room with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had made a decision and was going to stay with it. He was sworn in. Pierce asked him 3 questions. He answered all 3. He confirmed that he and his brother had commissioned the Geostar survey in 2015. He confirmed that the informal findings, including the margin notation, had been part of the file he had retained and subsequently transferred to the buyer as part of the land sale. He confirmed that in 2017, a representative of Vantage Energy had approached him and his brother and suggested they not disclose the Geostar survey findings to any potential buyers of the eastern parcel. In exchange for a commitment from Vantage to purchase remaining Decker holdings at favorable terms once a separate matter was resolved. Pierce asked, "Did you understand at the time what those findings represented in terms of the property's potential value?" Cole said no. "We knew there might be something worth a second look. We did not know what. They did not tell us what they knew, and we did not think to ask." Pierce asked, "Did you receive any payment from Vantage Energy for that agreement?" Cole said no payment, a handshake and a promise. Pierce said, "And did Vantage ever follow through on that promise?" Cole looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said no. Calloway's cross-examination of Cole lasted 11 minutes. It established that Cole had no documentation of the 2017 conversation, that it had taken place verbally in a private meeting, and that his account could not be independently corroborated. Calloway suggested that Cole's motivation for testifying might be related to his own exposure for having withheld information during the 2019 sale. Cole said he had disclosed everything material to the buyer at the time of sale, including the existence of the survey file. Calloway said that disclosing the existence of a file was not the same as disclosing its contents. Cole said, "You are correct, and I have to live with that." The board recessed for 30 minutes. Nora sat in the hallway with Pierce and Holden and a paper cup of water that she held without drinking. Holden said, "How are you holding up?" She said, "Fine." He said, "You know, this is going to be all right." She looked down the hallway at the institutional carpet and the fluorescent light and the window at the far end that showed a rectangle of September sky. She said, "I know." When the board reconvened, the lead administrator spoke for 8 minutes. He addressed the chain of custody question, found it established. He addressed the federal priority designation question, found it applicable and active. He addressed the competing claims framework, found that the surface ownership combined with the federal prior appropriation designation and the independent scientific assessment gave Nora Briggs's claim clear priority under Oklahoma administrative law. He addressed the GeoStar report discrepancy and noted that the board was referring the matter to the state attorney general's office for review of potential violations of the Oklahoma false reporting statute as it applied to submissions made to state resource agencies. He said the board's determination was in favor of the claimant Nora Briggs. Calloway requested an immediate stay pending appeal. The administrator said the appeal process was available to Vantage under standard procedure and that the stay request would be reviewed on its merits, but that the board's determination stood as issued. Nora heard the words. She did not react visibly. She had spent too many years watching things she had worked toward arrive quietly to feel that public reaction was the appropriate response. She thanked Pierce. She shook Holden's hand. She nodded to Cole Decker across the room. He nodded back. Neither of them said anything, which was the right amount to say. Hollis left the room before the administrator had finished speaking. She noticed that the appeal Vantage filed was withdrawn 14 weeks later. The Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation into the submission of the 2016 GeoStar report, and the calculus of continuing to fight a water rights determination while simultaneously managing a fraud investigation had apparently exceeded whatever Vantage's legal team had projected when they sent a man in a good jacket to a county auction in March. Pierce called Nora on a Thursday morning in January to tell her the appeal had been withdrawn. She said it in the same tone she would have used to report any other administrative fact, which Nora appreciated. There was no performance of triumph. There was just the information and what they needed to do next. What they needed to do next was structure the agreement. Nora spent 3 weeks in consultation with Pierce and with a water management specialist Holden recommended before she agreed to a single term. She was not in a hurry. The rights were established. The formation was not going anywhere. She wanted to understand what she was agreeing to before she agreed to it, which had always been her practice with anything that bore her signature. The agreement she reached was with the Oklahoma Agricultural Water Authority, a state-affiliated body that administered long-term water supply contracts for agricultural and rural municipal use. The terms were specific extraction capped at a rate that Holden's modeling indicated the recharge zone could sustain indefinitely, quarterly monitoring of the formation's pressure levels, an immediate halt provision if any monitoring cycle showed depletion beyond established parameters, and a revenue structure that returned a percentage of water sales to Nora over the lifetime of the agreement. She did not sell the rights. She did not take a single large payment. She took a structure that would pay her consistently for as long as the formation held, provided that it was managed the way she had decided it would be managed, which was the way she managed everything, with attention to what the land could actually sustain rather than what the maximum extraction rate technically permitted. The first revenue payment arrived in April. She deposited it and then sat at the kitchen table for a while with her coffee going cold in front of her, looking at the deposit receipt. The number on it was larger than any single number that had passed through her hands in 35 years of farming. She thought about $40 an acre. She thought about a loan officer saying reasonable agricultural basis twice in 6 minutes. She thought about a paragraph in the agricultural newsletter and the particular confidence of a man who had never once gotten his boots dirty on ground he was commenting on. She did not feel vindicated. That was not what she felt. What she felt was something quieter than that, something that did not have a clean name, the particular satisfaction of a person who had stayed with a question long enough to find out what it was actually asking. She used a portion of the first payment to begin the soil restoration work on the 220 acres, agricultural gypsum to correct the sodium levels in the surface soil, rebuilt irrigation infrastructure in stages, beginning with the northern section where the topography was most workable, drought-tolerant cover crops to stabilize the ground above the recharge zone and protect the formation from surface disruption. She hired 2 workers from the county, one of them the son of a family she had known for 20 years, and she paid them a wage that did not require them to hold a second job. By the following spring, Green was returning to ground that had not grown anything purposeful in over a decade. Not all of it, not quickly. Land does not recover on a schedule that accommodates impatience. And Nora had never been the kind of farmer who confused speed with progress, but in the sections where the gypsum had worked deepest into the soil column, where the irrigation had been running long enough to begin flushing the sodium accumulation downward, the ground was changing. Curtis came by one afternoon in May. He parked at the fence line and stood looking at the northern section for a long time without speaking. Nora walked over and stood beside him. He said, "I owe you more than an apology." She said, "You told me." That was the thing that mattered. He said, "I almost did not." She said, "I know." They stood for a moment, watching the cover crop moving in the afternoon wind, that specific pale green of something new, deciding whether to hold. He said, "Miriam is doing better." She finished her last treatment in February. Nora said, "I am glad to hear that." He said, "That check is still in the envelope. I never cashed it." She said, "Use it for Miriam." He looked at her. She said, "I mean that. Not because I forgive you the way a person forgives a debt, because that money came from people who used your worry against you, and putting it toward her treatment is the right thing to do with it." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You are a strange woman. Nora Briggs." She said, "I have been told." He laughed, a short, honest sound that the afternoon absorbed without ceremony. The investigation into the GeoStar report proceeded through the year. The engineer who had signed the altered submission cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced personal exposure. The internal communications that cooperation produced demonstrated that the decision to suppress the recharge zone findings had been made at the regional management level within Vantage, and that Hollis had been briefed on the suppressed data before attending the auction in March 2019. He resigned from Vantage in November. The company reached a settlement with the state attorney general's office the following spring, the terms of which were sealed, though the existence of the settlement was public record. Cole called Nora in the fall. He said Warren had decided to sell the remaining Decker holdings and retire, and that he himself was not sure what he was going to do next. He said he was sorry for the part he had played in how things had unfolded, not meaning the original land sale, meaning the conversation with Vantage in 2017 and the handshake that should not have happened. Nora said you told the truth when it counted. That has weight. He said it took me too long to get there. She said most people never get there at all. There was a pause on the line, and then he said, "Do you think the land will come all the way back?" She looked out the window toward the eastern fence line. She said yes. Not the same way it was before. That is not how land works. But it will come back to something. He said that is good to know. The 40 acres 12 miles to the west had been sitting in the bank's property inventory for over 2 years. No buyers. The ground was not difficult ground. It was workable wheat land that had simply been orphaned by circumstance. And banks are not equipped to be patient with orphaned things. In December, Nora called the bank's asset management officer and asked what they were asking for it. The number was not large. It was not $40 an acre, but it was not far from what the land would have sold for in a normal year to a buyer with a normal plan. She made an offer. The bank accepted it within the week. She drove out to the 40 acres on a Saturday morning in January, the kind of cold, clear Oklahoma morning where the sky is so blue it looks artificial and the ground is hard underfoot and the air has a sharpness she had always associated with the start of things rather than the end of them. She had not stopped here since the bank had taken it. She had slowed down every time she passed, had not stopped. She parked at the old gate. The gate was still there. The same one Ray had hung in 1984, sagging slightly on its lower hinge now, but intact. She got out. Pepper was not with her anymore, had been gone since the previous spring, and the absence was still something she navigated around, the way you navigate around furniture that has been moved from a room it occupied for years. She walked through the gate without touching it. The field was fallow. Winter grass had taken hold across most of it, the kind of thin, voluntary cover that moves in when cultivated ground is left alone long enough. The old equipment shed at the north end still stood. The windbreak row along the west fence was intact, the trees taller than she remembered, which meant she had not been accurately tracking time. She walked to the center of the field. She stood there for a while. The wind came from the northwest, the way it almost always did in January, steady and unhurried. The kind of wind that does not announce itself, but is simply there. The way all the permanent things are simply there. She reached behind her out of habit for the hand probe she always carried, and then remembered she had not brought it. She had come here to stand here, not to measure anything. There was nothing left to measure. She knew what this ground was. She had known it for 35 years. She thought about Ray, standing in this same field in the early years, talking about the ground the way you talk about something you have chosen rather than inherited, with the seriousness of a man who has decided that this is where his life is going to take place and means to be adequate to that decision. She thought about the version of herself who had stood beside him then, 30 years younger, certain that the ground they were standing on was sufficient for everything they planned to build on it. She thought about $40 an acre and a truck driving away and 3 words written at the top of a blank page. And then she stopped thinking and just stood there, which felt like the right thing to do. Nora had not found the aquifer because she was smarter than the people who had walked that ground before her. She had found it because she had been willing to stay with a question until it answered itself, to measure what was measurable and to wait for what was not, to refuse the conclusion that something was finished before she had finished looking. That was not genius. It was not luck. It was a habit she had built over 35 years of paying attention to ground that most people looked at and saw only the surface of. She bent down and pressed her palm flat against the January earth of her husband's field. The soil was cold, hard with frost at the surface. 6 inches down, it would be looser. 2 feet down, it would be workable. By April, it would be ready. She stayed there for a long moment with her hand against the ground. Then she stood up, walked back to the truck, and drove home to start the season's records.